Hi, welcome back. Here we are at week 5. We're a little over halfway there. This week we'll be addressing sport ethics and gender. We'll be pulling from English's article on sex equality in sport. We'll also be addressing Simon Torres and Hager's chapter 5 on gender equity in sport. This chapter asks the question, what does justice require? First, we'll be taking a look at English's article on sex equality in sport. Couple of things I want us to note from English's article. We'll be thinking about this and addressing this from general sociological concepts. That is, how do we view sex equality in society? Then we'll be thinking about how then we might apply these concepts to sport. Let's address this concept of equality. In most fields or societal aspects, we can look at men and women as both having opportunities to succeed. In sport, however, biological differences seem to put men and women on different playing fields. English is going to help us address then these biological differences and ways then that we can highlight a women's biological difference in order to consider what sports might be best for a female body. Let's start off and address these 3 standard accounts that English addresses from the literature. I have 2 of them here. Our third will be on the next slide. And as I've already previously stated, please make note that we'll be thinking about these from a general societal aspect, and then we'll address how we might apply them to sport. First of all, we have what is non-discrimination or formal equality. This considers that we only look at those qualifications that are relevant. I have an example here. If we would consider then only the qualifications that are relevant when we consider law school applicants, then there would be what we should call a blind approach. That is, the applications for law school would be based upon qualifications. Those qualifications might be such things as GPA, GRE scores, or LSAT scores. In addition, it might be based upon work or work history in a law firm and the like. In this example then, particularly when we're considering law school and or this blind approach, things such as gender, race, or socioeconomic status wouldn't be considered. When we think about this approach as applying it to sport, this blind approach, English wants us to recognize that if we utilize this approach in sport, women would have less opportunities than what they have today. And obviously, I've given the example of law school and how we might apply this kind of non-discrimination or blind approach. And hopefully you recognize this is not indeed how our admission systems actually go about choosing law school applicants. However, it's important to note that in certain areas, civil rights, social justices, and the list could go on, there should indeed be a blind approach. That way, everyone has an equal opportunity. Okay, concept number 2, this notion of equal chances. In the literature, this concept establishes that all individuals should have equal chances. Some call this equal probability. English wants us to note, though, there are certain positions that require some skills. So, for example, not everyone should have an equal chance of being a firefighter or a police officer. There are certain skills that are required to complete the job. We also could think about this about being a doctor or a lawyer. Not everyone should have an equal chance at being a doctor or a lawyer. Why? There's certain skills involved. Even if we think about this on somewhat of a comical example, when you go to the physician, you absolutely hope that your physician has the skills necessary, those that were required, one, to get into law school, but to complete the rigorous curriculum. So, while there are definitely things in society we should have equal chances to, English wants us to recognize there are definitely some jobs that isn't the case. Okay, so how does this apply to sport? For English, she wants us to know, especially as we address women, that women and girls should have equal chances to basic benefits. What are basic benefits? For English in sport, these are such things as the ability to be healthy, physically active, take part in a team, and the like. These are basic benefits that are offered in health, recreation, and/or fun. Therefore, she would deem it unethical to exclude anyone, actually regardless of gender, because they are unskilled. She deems that all individuals should have an equal chance to these basic benefits derived out of sport and physical activity. And again, these can be things like health, recreation, and fun. We are now on to our third standard account of equal opportunity in the literature. Number one was that non-discrimination or formal equality. Number two were those equal chances and or what we would call equal probability. And number three is what English just considers equal chances across major social group. How do we address this and or how does this considered addressed in the literature? English does this or considers this by averaging. Therefore, if a certain percent of the population is, as my example indicates, African American, then equal chances across major social groups would ensure that roughly 25% of the lawyers are African American. This takes consideration of race, class, and gender. So, how can we apply this to sport? For English, this looks slightly different. Remember, previously, under equal chances, we talked about basic benefits. That is, all individuals should have equal chances and equal access to the basic benefits derived out of sport and physical activity. For English, then, these equal chances across major social groups when applied to sport is in consideration of what she believes to be scarce benefits. And those that derive or come out of sport, those scarce benefits can be defined as fame, fortune, and or media coverage. And she believes then that these scarce benefits should be distributed in this equal chances across social groups manner. Okay, so this method, as we already said, is not an appropriate way to distribute those basic benefits. However, she believes this may help indeed raise the fame and fortune offered to our elite female athletes. As right now, if I began to ask you, we could probably name a few elite female athletes. However, in comparison, the fame, fortune, and media coverage offered to males and male athletes is much greater than the statistical proportional representation across our social group. So what does English believe this will indeed do for women and women's sports? She thinks that when women are not represented in elite sports, women may lose self-respect and or role models. So this is one of those opportunities English believes to help increase those things. Please recall that this is an application to scarce benefits. She doesn't believe this should be applied to basic benefits. Obviously, basic benefits, she believes all should have equal chances. I also want us to recognize that we've talked about these kind of three standard accounts of equal opportunity in the literature, and we are applying them to gender. English applies them to gender. I also think it's important to note that these can be applied to many other social classifications in society. We can apply them to such things as racial constructs, maybe religious constructs, and or then obviously, as English does, applies it to gender. The second portion of English's article moves on to think about sport-specific ways to deal with these physiological and or biological differences across the gender. We are going to specifically apply this to sport. She offers three suggestions or opportunities to think about this. Our first is handicapping, our second is ability grouping, and our third will be on the next slide, creation of different sports. For the most part, you are already probably aware of this notion of handicapping and ability grouping. We do this often and frequently in sport. English wants us to think about it in a couple additional ways as well. So let's first think about handicapping. English brings out the option that one way to deal with our biological differences across the gender is to use relevant physical characteristics to create competitive classes. We do this already. We have such things like age groups in youth sport. We have weight categories in other sport, whether that's Pop Warner or wrestling and or boxing or MMA. We also do this based upon sometimes at also other junctures, just physical size. Therefore, for English, this notion of characterization based upon these competitive classes would allow women to move up, she says, to men's sports. And she wants us to think long term. While we may segregate a sport now based upon these competitive classes, English wants us to recognize that the physiological gap may grow smaller if we continue to allow women to move up or even move into men's divisions. If so, she argues, let men and women compete against each other. Why are we doing this? The point is to stake out a place in sports so that women have an opportunity to play. English recognizes that this connects back to our equal opportunity across social groups and self-respect. This handicapping, as we know it, in our current sports system, we've been doing this based upon gender. We group these competitive classes and we do it by gender as well. And so for English, I think she would encourage us to continue to do this. However, she would like us to recognize that there could be some crossover. Our second way to deal with these biological and or physiological differences is ability grouping. And this is that we ensure no one is excluded and we allow everyone to receive basic benefits through participation. Please note this. For this concept, this would relate back to English's discussion on equal chances or equal probability. That is, all should have access or equal chances to these basic benefits. So how can then we make these groupings appropriate? Simply group them based upon ability. I think we see this oftentimes in intramural sports at collegiate levels, where we may have a beginner level, an intermediate level, and or an advanced level. Dependent upon your ability is where you're placed in this grouping. And for English, why do we do this and why is this important rather? That the emphasis is not on elitism. It's not on performance, but rather this ability to play and be involved and gather self-esteem. Please note that connection goes back to what she would consider our basic benefits. We've now made it to our third sport-specific way to deal with the biological and or physiological differences across the genders. We've already addressed handicapping and we've already looked at ability groupings. We'll be going on now to think about this creation of sports favorable for a female body. I first want us to start off and think about what sports we like and why we like them, maybe even what sports we watch. As I give a comparison, I want you to think about if, for example, do you watch men's basketball? Do you watch the NCAA championships and or do you watch the NBA? And in the same token then, do you watch the women's game? So let me ask again, do you watch men's basketball? And why indeed do you like it if you do watch the game? I'm a big LeBron James fan. So I do indeed like to watch the NBA and I like to watch LeBron. Why? Because it's fast and he dunks and he blocks it off the backboard and the list could go on. In the same token then, if I asked you what are the things you like, you would give me your list. If we move conversely though and think about the women's game, what are things we like or don't like about it? And what is the point in doing this? I want us to recognize there are certain things and ways our bodies are made, particularly as we think about these biological differences that favor a men's body and ultimately some of the things we love about men's sports. Those things like power, strength, and speed. I love the fact that LeBron dunks and I love the fact that he blocks off the backboard. But LeBron is also a very large human. And there are few women on the converse that have similar physical characteristics. And so proportionally, men have much greater a number of athletes with these kind of dominating physical characteristics that are very unique to the game of basketball. Okay, let me ask you this then. How many of you like to watch gymnastics? And for you, maybe it's when the Olympics come around, you like to watch Team USA competing. And in those instances, I want you to think about, can you imagine LeBron James on the balance beam? On a beam that's roughly 4 inches wide? No, he would be terrible. Why? Because LeBron's body does not meet the requirements or standards for someone that competes on the balance beam. Typically, that individual is quite small. low center of gravity, quite flexible. Our list could go on. So why am I giving us these examples? Because I want us to recognize, and this is where English goes. In our current society, we value sports that are power, strength, and speed sports. And for the most part, those favor a male body. And therefore, English wants us to recognize that if we begin to think about, highlight, and or even increasingly market sports that are favorable for a female's body, we may look at this differently. She also points out that maybe just this creation of sports that favor women's bodies will indeed reshape our thinking, or it's this way that we highlight them. We're now going to move on and talk about Simon, Torres, and Hager's chapter 5. And in this chapter, they address gender equity in sport, and they begin to ask the question, what does justice require? I want us to note, though, that we will pull several things we've already learned from English, and Simon, Torres, and Hager will highlight those points really nicely in the coming slides. Simon, Torres, and Hager begin some of their discussion surrounding these ideals of gender equity. They provide us two models or approaches to think about gender equity. I want to spend some time addressing them here and talking our way through them. So there's quite a bit on these slides, but let's make sure we get this in the details. Simon, Torres, and Hager first start off with what is their sex blindness approach. This would be that assimilationist model. And this model, they believe, or holds the following premises: that sex should play no role in basic benefits, civil rights, civil liberties, justice, distribution of social benefits, etc. And this easily ties into several of the concepts we pulled from English. Think about that idea of non-discrimination or formal equality. That's our notion of equal opportunity. Okay, so when we begin to make these concepts applicable to sport, it's important to know what an assimilationist would say. Their belief that separate is not acceptable. And we'll see that in just a minute when we think about this idea of separate but equal in sport. So for an assimilationist, they would then say that it's separate is not acceptable. Okay. Our second approach is this pluralistic model. This is the notion of sex blindness with equivalent benefits. Think, in our language, separate but equal. And that is a very strong separate but equal. And so this model specifically holds that no one gender, no one religion, no one race, no one socioeconomic status even is placed in dominance over the other. It is truly separate but equal. So how would this pluralistic model think about this application to sport? They also want us to recognize that they reject strict gender roles. And this model then would consider how we can deal with these biological differences between the genders. Think back also how we thought about those with handicapping and ability grouping, and as well as creation of new sports in English's article. For the pluralistic model, separate but equal is indeed a way to address these biological differences. We're going to talk, though, further about this strong notion, though, of what truly separate but equal means. Let's evaluate this pluralistic model even a bit further. Remember, separate but equal. So, I want us to think about or ask this question to you and ponder. Does separate but equal just reinforce or maybe even mask a system of inequality for women in sport? I do want us to note, though, there is a point for separate but equal. Specifically in sport, the purpose of separate teams for men and women is to indeed allow and expand upon playing opportunities for women. Think back to what English also articulated, that without this notion of separate but equal, women would indeed have less opportunities than they currently have. Thus, we have to recognize that separate but equal opportunities have indeed increased playing opportunities for women. I also want us to note this As we already discussed in the previous slide, those assimilationists would think that separate but equal in other spheres or avenues uh, would be unbeneficial to women. However, it may not be the same in sport. As we've already indicated, abolishing this separate but equal could potentially reduce the actual chances for women's opportunity in sport. However, a pluralistic model and an evaluation of this pluralistic model, it's important to note that there has resulted in this culture of inferiority. So I'm going to return us to our question. Does this separate but equal just reinforce or maybe even mask a system of inequality for women? So this culture of inferiority has resulted, and I've given it here kind of these three overarching ways, and I want to talk about them at length. First of all, this culture of inferiority has surrounded women's sports in the area of funding. Women's sports programs receive less financial funding and coaching than men's programs. And if this is true, then true pluralism, this true separate but equal, indeed hasn't been employed. So according to Simon, Torres, and Hager, if we're going to address this less funding discussion, then truly women must be given equal support. This is done in funding, facilities, scholarship, recruiting, coaching, and the like. In addition, the second way we see this culture of inferiority manifested is that we view contests between men's and women's teams as less exciting and less interesting. That is, our view on men's sports is that it ultimately is more exciting and more interesting than women's contests. Simon, Torres, and Hager want us to think about these couple things. Just because men's teams might be indeed superior, I'll talk about that a little more in a minute, does not mean that they're always more exciting or more interesting. For example, let's think about this. What about a well-played, competitive high school championship game? And arguably that game could be between women and girls. That game indeed be more exciting, and it may be more interesting than some mediocre college and or even professional game. And so one of the things Simon, Torres, and Hager want us to note that this culture of inferiority around surrounding separate but equal has resulted in this stigma that women's sports indeed are less interesting and less exciting. Third concept around this culture of inferiority is that the argument is men's teams will always beat women's teams. And we can think about this. And while the claim is likely true, and if it were not true, there would be no need for separate but equal teams. I recognize that. So the portion of this claim is indeed true because we do indeed need separate but equal. However, because a men's team will always beat a women's team, does that mean that game or the women's sport is ultimately inferior? Think back to our example earlier of English regarding this kind of creation of sports that favor a women's body. Just because women's sports may not be as power, speed, and high-paced as men's teams and our men's sports, does that mean they're inferior? So this just gives us some way to think about and or maybe even evaluate that pluralistic model. Some of the resultants in this culture of inferiority has come about because we do indeed have separate but equal. And we have less funding, and we consider women's sports to be less interesting and exciting. And ultimately, we give the claim that because men's teams will always beat women's teams, that women's teams are inferior. As every good discussion surrounding sport and gender equity includes, we must also address Title IX. I've briefly given us an overview here of the history of the law and then what the requirements of the law are. Many of you already know this, but it's always good to refresh. And then we're going to move on and think about the ethical application of this law. As you know, and as many of you do indeed, might even be able to quote this, Title IX was enacted in 1972, written by Birch Bayh, and it stated that no person in the U.S. shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any federal education program. It's important to note for this discussion, the original intention of this law was simply education. It had little to do with athletics. However, we've seen it played out in case law that athletics is one of the supreme and key purposes of the law today. It's important to note there were two really interesting cases early on that impacted the development of this law. And particularly as we think about Grove City College versus Bell, this was done in 1984, so keep your dates in mind here. The law was enacted in 72, and in 1984 was Grove City College versus Bell. One of the arguments with this is that because of the outcome of Grove City College versus Bell, Title IX was lagged, I should say, or kind of took a step back in its enforcement. So Grove City College versus Bell determined that institutions receiving federal funds only had to comply in areas that directly received federal funds. So for example, if the math department on a college campus directly received federal funds, then the math department must indeed comply by Title IX. However, if the athletic department did not receive direct federal funds, then the athletic department did indeed not have to comply by Title IX. And this then resulted in a backwards movement of Title IX, as you should understand. The Civil Rights Restoration Act came about roughly 4 years later, and this overturned Grove City College versus Bell. So instead now, the law states that if any portion of a university and or education system receives any type of federal funds, then all components of that system must indeed comply by Title IX. Title IX really didn't get any teeth, however, until 92. So make that note. 20 years after the enactment of the law, Title IX finally got some teeth. And that came in the case of Franklin versus Gwinnett County Schools. In this instance, Franklin, a plaintiff, ultimately was entitled to punitive damages or money. And so this, and 20 years again after the enactment of the law, finally the law got some teeth. That is, if institutions were not in compliance or following the letter of the law, they could indeed be punished with damages and or being required to pay back a plaintiff. So what are then the requirements of the law? As it currently states, Title IX requires that institutions be compliant in these three areas: financial aid and scholarships, athletic interest and abilities, and benefits and rewards. And how might they show compliance? 3 ways: proportionality, history of progress, and accommodation of interest and abilities. Proportionality is that notion that indicates that the proportion of athletic opportunities on campus must be plus or minus 5% of the student body. Therefore, if the student body is 50% women, then 45 to 55% of the athletic opportunities on campus must be for females. That's a safe harbor. If an institution is able to show that, they are then designated compliant and they don't have to move on. It's important to note that institutions only have to show one of the prongs to indicate compliance. The second prong, is history of progress. This has no concrete way, and it's actually rather gray, in order to indicate compliance. The institution just has to show a history of progress. Lastly is the third prong, this accommodation of interest and abilities. And in this prong, the institution only has to show that they are indeed accommodating the interests and abilities of the underrepresented sex. As some of you may know, and maybe even have experienced, there are several key critiques of this law. I want to address those here, and I want us to think about then how we can make those connection to ethics. Mainly, the application of this law surrounds problems with proportionality. It's important to note, or we have seen rather, that the application of the letter of the law has resulted in a reduction in men's opportunities rather than this increasing of women's opportunities. That is, in order for institutions to gain compliance, they have often followed the proportionality route, and instead of increasing women's opportunities, they've rather gone the route of reducing men's sports in order to make that number between student body and athletic opportunities more proportional. So I want us to begin to think about this, and I want us to think about what's wrong with that. And then we'll think about what that means in terms of an ethical perspective. First of all, there's several responses to this kind of critique of the problems with the proportionality prong. One is that we have to recognize that Title IX requires compliance under 3 prongs, and proportionality isn't the only way to gain compliance. Furthermore, Title IX does not require the elimination of teams. Rather, it's been the budget concerns of athletic departments that have resulted in men's programs being cut. We have to recognize that ignoring these budget concerns when adding women's teams is a serious budget concern. So I want to pose the question then, why not just reduce some of the resources for men's sports and rather than blame women's programs for needing funding? It's an interesting argument. Also, we have to note that it may not necessarily be wrong to reduce men's opportunities because at this point in time, they have previously been awarded a disproportionate amount of the resources. I want to provide this example, and while it may be kind of silly, I think it'll help us go there. Think, for example, of a family, and they have one child. And during that time when that child is the only child number 1 gets all of the attention, all of the resources. Why? Because there's only one child. Family has decided then to have a second child, and so now child number 2 comes into the mix. It's completely logical then that resources, attention, now get split or even shared among the 2 children. And I want to think about this in its application to collegiate sport and or school sport. Historically, we only had men's sports. It got all the resources. And now that second child is coming along, women's sports. And so it seems only logical then that maybe we should indeed split some of the resources. We've had this critique, though, that there has been this kind of history that women just aren't interested in men's sport, in sport in general. It's important to note, though, historically, females have not received that same encouragement that men have. And so we can argue that they aren't just interested, but that's a fairly short-sighted argument, when there has been little emphasis or encouragement given to women. Lastly, I want us to think about this concept of a zero-sum game. We talked about this very early on. The current view of gender equity is that this notion that only one side can win. So that if men's sports get resources, women lose. But if women's sport get resources, men lose. And because of this kind of perspective, we've had this kind of animosity and discord across programs, specifically separate by the genders. It's resulted in a disdain for women's sports, and because they're arguably stealing, quote unquote, opportunities from men. So how do we think about this? How do we address these key critiques of the law? I want us to then think about our ethical application of Title IX. And in many ways, we followed the letter of the law. We've worked towards this kind of proportionality and or opportunities for women, but we've done so by reducing men's. And I think in many ways, if we think about the spirit of this law, the spirit of the law is not to indeed reduce men's opportunities, but to rather increase women's. And so in doing this, our ethical application of the law gets called into question. It's hard to apply this law. It's hard to consider we have to cut budgets for men's programs in order that we can add budgets for women's programs. But isn't that what gender equity requires? And isn't that what justice requires? Okay, we've reached the end of our week 5 lecture. We've gone a long way today. We started off with discussing English's article. We thought about how those concepts could apply to society, and then we thought about how her concepts then could consider and be applied to sport. We looked at 3 ways to deal with our biological differences with handicapping, ability grouping, and the creation of women-specific sports. We then moved on to talk about Simon, Torres, and Hager and addressed a pluralistic model and assimilationist model. We also gave some discussion to Title IX and thought about the ethical application of the law. That's it for this week. I'll see you next week in week 6.